Hey up campers, Johnny Matthew here. I hope you are okay on this fine day. Well, in fact, it's chucking it down here in South Wales at the moment. But anyway, welcome. It is great to have you here. Welcome back to the blog. If you have been here before, if you are a first-time visitor, really welcome. It's lovely to have you here. If you'd like to get these regularly, you can just click the subscribe button in the text post. If you'd like to become a paid subscriber, I'd be very grateful for that. You can, I think it's about £5. You can do that again in the text post, but there's no pressure whatsoever for that. You are welcome to this. So this is the second in our little series of 2 posts on HSB Practice Lessons. This comes following the publication a couple of weeks ago, so that will be late Jan, early February 2026, of a book called Cultural Responsivity in the Treatment of Sexual Violence, which my colleague from the Child Sexual Abuse Centre for Expertise, Sharon Wareham, and myself contributed to. So it just set me thinking. I've been writing a bit about this, just finished another little piece on harmful sexual behaviour and HSB for another publication. So I've been in this zone for a little while writing, so I thought I'd just whiz out some practice lessons for you guys. So we had one last week and this is the second one of those. So let's get into it. Here we go. HSB Practice Lessons number 2. Introduction. In our last post, we began looking at some practice lessons for working with harmful sexual behaviour, or HSB, in children and teenagers. This came off the back of a book chapter, as I said, that I co-authored with my fellow HSB specialist, Sharon Wareham. The points we drew out in the first post, and there's a link to that in the blog on Substack, were as follows. So there was 4 of these in the last post. Number 1, keep in mind that age is not the same as maturity. Number 2, harmful sexual behaviour is often developmentally out of sequence. Number 3, victim-perpetrator split is a false one. And number 4, behaviour as a function even when it is harmful. So that's the first 4, and there was a couple of introductory bits prior to those in last week's post. So if you search up on Substack HSB Practice Lessons number 1, you should be able to find that. So here are the remaining 5 practice lessons, making 9 in total, which I appreciate is a completely arbitrary number. That's because I just sat down and wrote these, and it's not the result of any great research process or anything. So as always, please bear in mind that these are things that came to mind when I was drafting these posts. They're by no means exhaustive, but I hope they'll be helpful. So here we go. I've got 5 more practice lessons for you. So HSB Practice Lessons continued. So these will be numbers 5 to 9. So number 5, punishment rarely leads to safety or change. A strong theme in the chapter that Sharon and I wrote is the damage caused by punitive responses. When it comes to punishment, the obvious candidate is the criminal justice system, or the CJS. Because that, at least in part, is its function. To mete out justice implies that the victim is recognised as such and the offender is punished. But other responses to HSB in children can be equally, if not more, punitive than prosecution, actually. I've lost count now how many kids suffer what can only be described as punishment, but not from the criminal justice system. So 3 quick examples. Being labelled inside and outside the family as some kind of weirdo or pedo or, countless other pejoratives. Being made to leave home in order to protect others, albeit that one or some of those others that are in the home may well have been or have previously abused or abusing this kid, sometimes for years. But then when this child acts out that stuff, they're the one that gets asked to leave. And then being kicked out of school is a classic. And the problem with that is that the child then becomes bereft of routine, stability, friendships, and the positive adults that school offers. And again, it's usually due to some malformed concept of being risky, inverted commas, to other kids, and you get this knee-jerk reaction. And on it goes. So while we, the observing adults, may not see these things as punishments per se, that's absolutely how these kids see them. Or certainly it's how they feel them, which might be a more accurate way of looking at it. Some of the trickiest hurdles I've had to deal with in the treatment of HSB children over the years are the complex grief, resentment, bemusement and or utter rejection felt when these kind of things happen. Perhaps the greatest argument for the suspension, if not outright rejection, of the punishment paradigm is the distraction it becomes to the treatment process itself. So the kid does something that gets tagged as harmful sexual behaviour. These knee-jerk reactions, they get labelled, they have to move home, at least for a while, or they get kicked out of school, or all three. And then they get into a treatment process, and all of that other stuff becomes a distraction. So I find myself spending weeks and weeks helping a child navigate the confusing vagaries and painful disruptions of these other things rather than the behaviour itself. I'm not dealing with the HSB, I'm dealing with a child who's not able to live at home, or a child who's been kicked out of school and so on. Now, while these things happen because of the HSB, the harmful sexual behaviour, they also distract terribly from it. So the child's focus moves from what really matters, the roots and meaning of the HSB itself, to the reactions of others to it. Now, in the blog post itself, I've actually put a couple of links to some papers, and there is a paper in there, Young People Who Display Harmful Sexual Behaviours in Their Families. It's a qualitative, systematic review of their experiences of professional interventions by Campbell et al. So if you're interested in that kind of idea of how these negative reactions to the HSB contribute to that might be worth a read. So in this context, there are a few things, I've got 5 things here that are worth noting. Firstly, most kids with harmful sexual behaviour don't go on to do it again once it's been discovered and treated. And there's a reference for that if you want to read more on that as well. Secondly, outcomes improve significantly when children receive timely, appropriate help and see treatment interventions through, rather than dropping out, because that can be a risk factor. Number 3, criminalisation often increases shame, isolation and distorted beliefs, and actually adds nothing to the treatment process, except the need to spend a lot more time doing it because it's actually feeding into the child's negative sense of themselves. Criminalisation often does that. Number 4, treatment doesn't require criminal prosecution in order to happen, certainly in most cases anyway. That depends, I guess, on the availability of local services to intervene effectively, but certainly where they're there, most of them don't require prosecution these days. And then lastly, worst case scenario is punishment without treatment, or with some kind of, off-the-shelf manualised program that doesn't or can't adapt to the individual needs of the child. Now again, as a developing human, every child, harmful sexual behaviour intervention is by definition unique, as it has to address this child's journey. No one else's. Now, if you want to look into that, you can see lessons 1 and 2 from the previous post. So, practice lesson summary here for punishment rarely leads to safety or change. Harmful sexual behaviour in children should sit within safeguarding and welfare systems wherever possible, not criminal justice responses, which overall tend to do more harm than good. The development of countrywide, effective, local, pre-court harmful sexual behaviour services for children of all ages should be a policy and provision goal of national government with the resources to match. Breathy and meaningful oratory, all that chin-rubby political stuff about addressing sexual violence needs to be backed up by robust legal processes and the cash to treat the abuse. not least in children. That would ensure we make quick and lasting strides towards a society free of sexual abuse. So that's number 5. Punishment rarely leads to safety or change. Number 6, assumed ability is a serious blind spot. Professionals frequently overestimate what children understand about sex and consent and harm. When I was a few years ago helping to manage a secure children's home, it never ceased to amaze me that a 16-year-old child, for example, might not know how to tie their shoelaces, or how much shampoo to put on their hair, or be able to use cutlery. So I'm never surprised when children know a lot less about sex, sexuality, and sexual behaviour than their age might suggest. Now, this is particularly the case, in my experience anyway, when it comes to teenagers, of course. Now, younger children attract a more consistent, let's give them the benefit of the doubt kind of approach from most adults, because they're little. But it's different with teens. There's a tendency to assume that because they're bigger, older, they're out there in the world, they've got access to the internet, etc., that somehow they can assimilate all that into a coherent sense of how this stuff works. But they can't, or not necessarily anyway. See, most abused and developmentally troubled kids will get by and make do and not harm anybody else along the way. But actually, many won't get by and do well, and they will harm some folk along the way. And when that journey, this troubled journey of theirs, includes sexual abuse of some kind, we shouldn't be surprised when a child's presentation of behaviour goes awry in the sexual domain. After all, how do you safely navigate and consistently and realistically get good information about the nuances, vagaries and subtleties of safe sexual exploration, reciprocity and informed consent when your only counsel is the internet? I dread to think. And particularly in this age of the kind of AI sort of dawn and what that's doing to the internet. I've just finished reading a fantastic book by Laura Bates called The New Age of Sexism, How the AI Revolution is Reinventing Misogyny. It is a blistering, eye-opening and quite disturbing account of sex on the internet. Now, kids are often better at navigating that domain than adults in that they know where to go and they're confident in online exploration. They've grown up digital, but the stuff they find is some of the most shocking material at times. So we need to not assume they know stuff. So here's a few things to remember. Sexual abuse can fundamentally distort a child's internal rule book. Now, what most kids imbibe and infer from years and years living and observing loving, pro-social adults in the family home, these kind of kids miss out on. So they end up with a deficient on a good day or distorted on a bad day script about how to conduct themselves sexually. Secondly, if the wider context of family relationships is dysfunctional, which it nearly always is in HSB cases, then the far more complex and granular intricacies of emerging sexuality will remain opaque too. So even kids who haven't been sexually abused, but may have endured poor attachment in early development, for example, will struggle to grapple successfully with their burgeoning adolescent selves, including their sexual selves. And then secondly, I guess this is about comorbidities and layered complexities that, learning disabilities, ADHD, autism and other neurodevelopmental conditions and trauma, of course, all affect judgment and impulse control. Taking account of the broader functional and developmental picture must be a primary focus of any treatment program. So we're on number 6 and we're looking at the assumed abilities, a serious blind spot. So here's the practice lesson summary here. Understanding must never be assumed. It needs to be assessed, supported, and reviewed. I try to make it a rule of thumb not only to ask the right questions, but to dig deeper to ensure that I and the child themselves themselves understand their answers. Children, particularly troubled kids, quickly learn to parrot things and parrot adults around them and what they say. Some of them can do it brilliantly because they're able to fit it with the context even. But we have to ensure that they understand the words themselves, lest we fall foul of assumed knowledge that isn't really there. So, we've had number 5, punishment rarely leads to safety or change. Number 6, assumed ability is a serious blind spot. Number 7, gender shapes how children are responded to by systems and by individuals. Responses to HSB are not gender neutral. I've worked in 2 places in my life that illustrate this point really well: the criminal justice system and the mental health system. Now, where I live in Wales, there are no prison custodial beds for women and girls, but there are hundreds for boys and men. And in the low secure mental health unit downstairs from my office in the health service, it's rare to see boys, but girls proliferate. Now, I can't emphasize enough, this is, I realize this is an oversimplification, but I think the point stands. We tend to categorize boys' aberrant behavior, particularly harmful sexual behavior, as criminal and girls as health related. Ergo, one is punished, or at least dealt with in a more punitive system, and the other one is treated. And just think about that. Boys much more likely to end up in prison for sexual behavior, whereas girls more often dealt with in hospital or community-based services. Now, in truth, for most kids displaying harmful sexual behavior, neither of these places is ideal for helping them process what's happened to them and move forward to better days. So in short, boys may be more likely to be viewed as dangerous and therefore get punished, or at the very least get made subject to a more punitive system. Girls, though, their HSB may be minimised, mislabelled, and perhaps seen as something in them that needs fixing, like an inherent vulnerability kind of psychopathology. Now, there are some significant outliers to this where girls' harmful sexual behaviour gets an even more punitive response than boys, and there is a detailed case study of that exact point in the book chapter. And then, lastly, gender stereotypes, particularly in the sexual domain, can obscure both vulnerability and risk in boys and girls equally. So this connects to point 3 made above, really, this idea in last week's post that the victim-perpetrator split, boys often more tagged as the offenders or the perpetrators, if you like. Forgive the use of these terms, but they do reflect the terms in the system and it helps for brevity. So boys more often tagged as offenders, girls more often as victims. Now, while the offender stats around prevalence and gender attributes support that broad kind of split, both these terms are a little odious to me as they bring to mind toxic generalities of predation and paralysis, respectively, neither of which does anything like justice to the complex nature of the HSB problem. And that idea is the quote graphic in the post for this week. So the practice summary around number 7 about gender shapes how children are responded to by systems and by individuals. The practice lesson summary here is: professionals must actively reflect on how gendered assumptions shape assessment and intervention, resisting the enmeshed inbuilt biases of male, female and victim offender which are so ingrained in our system. So that's the first 3 of this week's 5. Punishment rarely leads to safety or change, number 5. Number 6, assumed ability is a serious blind spot. And number 7, gender shapes how children are responded to. So I'm going to have a quick slurp of my drink and then I'll go through the last one for you. All right, so Practice lesson number 8, 2 more to go. Culture matters, but it must never excuse harm. Now, children develop within family and community cultures that influence beliefs about sex, power, gender roles, and relationships. For the purposes of this post, I'm thinking about wider cultural parameters like nationality, ethnicity, language, sex, and religion, as well as practical lived experience of how these play out in individual families. So in our practice, there are some basic principles I think it's useful to have in mind. Now, they are basic, but no less important for it. So I'll give you them as a list, and then I'll unpack each one briefly. Firstly, cultural humility is essential. Secondly, cultural stereotyping is dangerous. And thirdly, harmful experiences must never be minimized in the name of culture. So culture is essential. Cultural humility, rather, is essential, number 1. So it's easy to slip into assuming we know everything we need to know about somebody else's culture, when clearly we don't. In fact, even if we share the same culture, we definitely grew up in a different home at a different time with different people. And these factors alone make cultural humility a necessary prerequisite for our work. It's absolutely essential, that. Secondly, cultural stereotyping is dangerous. Now, following on from that previous point, if we flagrantly assume that we understand the broad range and granular nuances of another culture and how that culture may have impacted a child, not only are we open to major mistakes and misunderstanding, we almost certainly never be able to help to optimal effect, because those kind of tropes and heuristics will stick in our mind as biases. So we're not as analytical or as reflective, and therefore we're not able to be as flexible and bespoke in the interventions as we need to be. So cultural humility is essential. Cultural stereotyping is dangerous. And lastly, harmful experiences must never be minimized in the name of culture. So the question is not one of excuses, but of explanations. Examining the influence of wide and narrow cultural drivers on the emergence of HSB in a child is necessary in order to understand it better and treat it more effectively. It's never okay to minimize, play down, or somehow excuse HSB on the basis of culture. So cultural humility is important, cultural stereotyping is dangerous, and harmful experiences must never be minimized in the name of culture. Now, in our polycultural societies, those of us hailing from, big hegemonic groups, white people, kind of Western European background, statutory state education, heterosexual kind of family type, etc., etc. Those from these kind of backgrounds have grown used to tailoring our language and assumptions to people from other backgrounds so as not to offend. Now, such social complexities and allowances are really helpful and respectful, as well as, in my view, helping us to ensure that we enjoy and benefit from the delightful and multifaceted cultural traditions around us. The total is far greater than the sum of the individual parts. The kind of rainbow of cultural influences in modern Britain, to me, is a beautiful thing that needs to be celebrated. But we must never allow politeness, sensitivity, or the eagerness not to offend others to lull us into ducking the very real issues in play. While it can be tricky to navigate the space between honesty and openness about what's going on and differing cultural experiences and viewpoints, navigate it we must. It's better to confront the issues and find oneself on the receiving end of an angry service user or, an accusation of racism or, worse still, a complaint. Better to do that than it is to balk at the challenge, be distracted or diluted in our practice and find that we missed something. Or worse still, find that a child was not kept safe, that HSB wasn't assessed or treated properly, or, I mean, nightmare scenario, an adult abuser or abusers went unchallenged. Now, when religion and gender expectations converge, things can be very hard. And I'm not trying to minimize the sensitivity and the challenges of all this at all. But I think returning to our practice principles can help us here. Asking about things with a genuinely open desire to learn and understand. That kind of open, Socratic, gentle humility can really promote trust in situations where people in the cultural minority will not expect humility or respect. And demonstrating both of those things in spadefuls can be a bulwark against knee-jerk reactions from all concerned, and help relationships coalesce into something that can promote healing. So that's number 8, culture matters, but it must never excuse harm. So the practice lesson summary here for this one, number 8, is something can be culturally familiar and still harmful. Not assuming we know enough and instead taking time to ask about things in a firm but gentle way will help us to understand more and to practice better. In the end, though, safeguarding responsibilities always come first. First and foremost, this is not a deaf child, a Christian child, a same-sex parented child, or a Sikh child, just to name some examples off the top of my head. Above all, they are a child, and they may well be in need of our protection, regardless of cultural heritage, preference, or choice. We must act first to protect. So, we've had number 5, punishment rarely leads to safety or change. Assumed ability is a serious blind spot. Gender, number 7, shapes how children are responded to by systems and individuals. Number 8, culture matters, but it must never excuse harm. And then a shorter one to finish, you'll be delighted to know. Number 9, early warning signs are often missed. Many children show indicators of distress long before their behaviour escalates. And let me just run through. I've got 3 quick bullet points here. Sexualised behaviour in younger children is often silenced or redirected. So parental discomfort to notice and address sexual play, for example, that is out of sync developmentally or resistant to correction, can prolong the behaviour. It can help to entrench it, and unfortunately that in turn can increase treatment resistance later on. So sexualised behaviour in younger children are often silenced or redirected. Secondly, systems frequently wait until harm to others occurs before intervening. Again, I've lost count how many kids that have had to precipitate numerous HSB incidents before someone decides to ask the why question. Why does this behaviour keep happening? Well, it should only happen once for somebody to ask that question. But very often schools, social workers, and loads of others, I'm not picking on schools and social workers, often do not call a strategy meeting, for example, which they should rather, based on safeguarding and child protection guidelines. You should call a strategy meeting. If there's HSB, there should be a strategy meeting, certainly ideally, and certainly in Wales. And quite often don't even consider whether they should look more closely, which they absolutely should. So if this stuff happens, we should be getting on it, leaning in, asking questions. So sexualised behaviour in younger kids is often silenced or redirected. Systems often wait far too long till there's been multiple harms before they do anything. And then thirdly, opportunities for early recovery and course correction are lost. Most so-called harmful sexual behaviour will never develop into that if we're prepared to talk more openly, intervene more readily, and do so earlier. And the earlier the better, too, as children's problematic conduct is most effectively resolved if it's brought out into the open and addressed honestly with kindness at the first opportunity. We do not need a pattern of HSB before we can justify getting involved. In fact, the opposite is true. Now, many local authority areas have good systems in place. Partnerships with specialist services that can advise, formally or informally, those with the statutory duty of child protection. But many don't. So practitioners, teachers, social workers, foster carers and others are left to flounder for information and guidance about what to do and how to do it. But early intervention is key. So just to summarise, number 9, early warning signs are often missed. The practice lesson summary: early, curious and developmentally informed responses reduce harm and prevent escalation. HSB responses and system expectations should form part of all worker inductions, in my view, particularly in social work, foster care and residential care, but also for health visitors, youth workers, yacht teams, support staff, as well as those sort of less formal community-based things, people running sports clubs, Sunday school, play and youth groups, and numerous others. Everybody working with kids needs to know the signs and the fact that they need to do something straight away. There is no better intervention than an early intervention. And I've linked in the blog on Substack to the brilliant resources produced by the Child Sexual Abuse Centre for Expertise. Okay. What good HSB practice with children looks like? Well, across the book chapter, and more so in these 2 posts, I've tried to summarise what effective HSB practice consistently involves if it's to avoid a legion of pitfalls and optimise our service to the child and through them to their family and the wider community. So here's a bullet point distillation of today's 5 practice lessons. Number 1, avoid punishment and advocate for its avoidance wherever possible. Number 2, never assume a child has the knowledge or ability that their age might suggest. Number 3, sex and sexuality are inseparable from gender. Always consider that. Number 4, in formulation and assessment generally, ask how culture may have contributed. And then lastly, number 5, intervene as early as possible and train others to do the same. Useful treatment foci. In their qualitative systematic review of harmful sexual behaviour in teenagers. Now, this sample actually was all boys, unfortunately. So this is in itself biased and gendered in that respect. But this is Campbell et al. 2020. But they identified 5 key themes as critical components for successful intervention. So this is service users' observation about the professionals working with them. So again, I can't possibly do justice in a quick list to this, but it'll give you an idea about what people who are struggling with this stuff in their families found useful or not in the interventions. There's 5 of these really quick. Number 1, the key role played by the relationships between the young person and the practitioner. I love that. It's all about relationship. Number 2, the significance of the role played by the parents and carers. Number 3, the importance of taking account of the wider context in which the HSB took place. Number 4, the role of disclosure during the intervention process, not disclosure in a legal court sense, but disclosure when children begin to tell us about things that have happened to them in the past. And lastly, number 5, children need to be equipped with skills as well as knowledge. Just giving them some basic sex education and shoving them out the door isn't going to help. They need some social skills training as well around that. Now, of course, time and space isn't going to allow me to unpack these in more depth. Maybe there's another post for that later in the year. But you'll be able to see that there's some crossover with the content we've outlined in this post today and in last week's post. So as I look back over this now before hitting publish, I'm kind of struck by how much more could be said on each of these points, and almost could write a book chapter on each one, I think. But anyway, and already one or two other things come into mind that would also be good practice lessons. But I'm going to stop there for now. Final thoughts. Children and young people who display harmful sexual behaviour are obviously children and young people first. Their episode or episodes of HSB should not be allowed, either by us or by the system more generally, to define them. They are so much more than that. But when HSB takes place, someone nearly always suffers detriment or harm. Now, as practitioners, therefore, we have a duty to maintain the complex and sensitive balancing act that involves promoting safety for all while providing treatment that will avert future recurrence. And this is often referred to, including by me sometimes, as risk management and treatment provision. Now, this is not a binary choice that demands we choose which child to manage and which child to treat. Along with the victim-perpetrator split mentioned previously, this is just spectacularly unhelpful. But unfortunately, it still happens in the system. In my experience, all HSB kids, and again, that's a horribly labelling term, all children who've displayed harmful sexual behaviour have suffered. Usually some form of sexual abuse or early sexualization or exposure to completely, spectacularly inappropriate sexual material, but not always. But implicitly, they are all victims in some form or another. Now, if they've gone on then to display harmful sexual behaviour later, then they've all in some way or another put other people in harm's way. So we're holding both these things, victim and someone causing harm. So let's do away with stigmatizing taglines and unhelpful tropes in favour of seeing the child in the big picture of their lives. To me, there is no substitute for life course case formulation, looking at the child's life so far to see how they got here, because that will usually tell us where things got stuck, where things got a bit derailed or went awry a little bit, where the developmental blockers were sewn into this child's growth journey. And then we can go back to that, make these markers of a planned intervention or treatment program so that we can help them make the changes and learn the lessons that improve their life chances moving forward, as well as averting any recurrence and harm to other people. So for me, it helps to keep these things in mind so that I don't become part of the problem, adding to this iatrogenic sort of system around a system that tries to help but can so often do harm. Anyway, as always, when in doubt and not sure what to do, I revert to my tried and tested maxim: lean in, empathise, be kind. And that will get you over numerous complex hurdles and hopefully land you in a place where some sort of relational and empathic connection with the child will help them to engage, us to maximise the help that we can offer, and help both them to fulfil their potential and also to avert risk to other people going forward. So there you go. Lean in, empathise and be kind. Could have said it in, 7 words instead of 2 very lengthy posts. Anyway, I hope that's useful. That's HSB lessons number 2. And thanks for being here. There are loads of links, books, websites, previous posts, a couple of papers that are free to download if you want to read more over on Substack, johnnyvm.substack.com. You can always pop in there. But thanks for being here, and I will see you in the next one.